in the soft, sloping hills of Sumner County, Tennessee, where golden light spilled over fields of tobacco and the Cumberland River whispered through the valley. There once stood a monument to Southern industry, the Chamberlain Cotton Mill, rising from the earth like a red-bricked fortress. Its 3 towering stories caught the morning sun in broad, gleaming windows, reflecting the promise of progress. Locals called it a miracle of the postbellum South. Outsiders whispered it was built on secrets. Founded in 1863, during the deadliest years of the Civil War, the mill was the vision of a single man, Jeremiah Chamberlain, a silver-haired entrepreneur from Massachusetts who arrived in Tennessee with northern machinery, army contracts, and a gaze that seemed to pierce straight through you. He was just 28, but already carried the manner of a man who expected history to bend to his will. Jeremiah wasn't like the typical carpetbaggers who saw the South as little more than scorched opportunity. He came with letters of recommendation from Union officers and credentials from Lowell's textile mills. He understood cotton, not just how to spin it into uniforms and canvas, but how to use it as currency in a world where people were starving and desperate for work. The Chamberlain Cotton Mill opened its doors along Bledsoe Creek, the looms powered by water wheels that never ceased turning. His workers were a rotating mass of war-torn refugees, families displaced by raiders, women who had lost husbands, boys too young to be drafted. Chamberlain offered them shelter, wages, and work. He offered stability in a world on fire, but soon, folks in Gallatin began to murmur. The first clue that something wasn't right came not from the mill itself, but from its records found years later, sealed in a basement vault beneath a crumbling wall. From 1863 to 1867, 73 names vanished from the employment rolls. Not a single resignation, no death certificates, no transfer paperwork, just names scratched out in thick black ink, erased as if those people had never existed at all. Oddly enough, every disappearance aligned with the mill's most profitable production spikes. At the time, no one dared ask too many questions. Chamberlain's mill brought union dollars to a starving town. Local politicians were thrilled, merchants were grateful, and families relied on those jobs. To question the mill's methods was, too many, a betrayal of the only source of security left. But not everyone was so easily convinced. Caleb Craraven, just 12 years old in the winter of 1863, lived with his family on a modest farm bordering the Chamberlain property. He was a curious child, with a hunter's patience and the sharp vision of youth. While his father, Thomas, worked the fields and his mother tended the hearth, Caleb spent his days fishing along Bledsoe Creek and watching the world pass him by, especially the mill, which loomed like a shadow at the edge of his family's land. Caleb began to notice strange things. Every morning, he watched workers walk across the bridge into the mill, men, women, children, but at day's end, fewer returned. Faces changed too often. Families who moved into company housing simply vanished, their cabins left empty and silent. And then there were the wagons, always heavy laden, always leaving before dawn, canvas-covered and quiet, rolling south toward the Cumberland River. They came back empty. One night, Caleb took his father's spyglass and climbed into the attic, keeping a vigil through the frost-blurred window. The mill burned bright with lamplight, even as snow piled outside, and other homes darkened against the cold. But the mill never rested. Figures moved behind the windows, silhouettes hunched over machines, or something else. During a blizzard, in February, 3 days of bone-deep cold that froze the river solid, Caleb saw something that would haunt him for life. On the storm's second night, as sleet slashed sideways across the valley, he spotted a procession leaving the mill. A group of figures, workers, it seemed, being escorted at gunpoint across the snow to a shed behind the building. They walked slow, burdened by sacks or perhaps personal items, and the men surrounding them weren't fellow workers, they carried rifles. The next morning, the shed stood silent. The smoke from the mill's quarters had stopped. No fires burned in the chimneys where families should have been huddled for warmth. It was as though they had been erased overnight. Caleb told his father what he saw. His words tumbled out in a rush. The guards, the wagons, the strange lights. At first, Thomas Craven scolded him for spying, for sneaking about. Then Caleb showed him what he had found beneath the shed's loose floorboard, a small child's shoe, leather still supple, initials carved into the insole, M.E. Dated February 12th. Silence filled the room like a fog. Thomas turned the shoe over in his weathered hands, face paling. "You are never to speak of this again," he told Caleb sternly. "Not to your friends, not to your teacher, not to anyone. Do you hear me?" "But Pa," Caleb protested, "we have to tell someone." "No. His father's voice dropped, firm as stone. Men like Chamberlain don't answer questions. They make sure questions stop being asked. That night, Jeremiah Chamberlain himself appeared on their doorstep. He came smiling, dressed in a fine wool coat, eyes glinting like steel beneath the lantern light. He spoke politely about progress and land, offered them $500 in gold for a narrow strip of the creek that Caleb loved. Thomas declined. Chamberlain's eyes narrowed. "I understand family attachment," he said, "but progress waits for no man, and neither does opportunity." He let the threat dangle in the air like a noose. Within 3 days, Thomas sold the land, but Caleb's curiosity, now sharpened into fear, could not be sold off. Something monstrous lurked behind the brick walls of the Chamberlain cotton mill, and he was the only one paying attention. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that the mystery of the missing workers would only deepen, and that the truth was far worse than anything the boy could imagine. For, in the very heart of Tennessee, the wheels of industry were turning on something darker than cotton, something soaked in blood, silence, and fire. When the storm of February 1863 finally loosened its grip on Sumner County, the town of Gallatin emerged from its blanket of snow like a breath held too long. Trees groaned under the weight of ice, telegraph wires sagged and snapped, and roads became ribbons of white mud. Most homes stayed dark and cold during the blizzard, but the Chamberlain cotton mill, it never went dark. Even at the height of the storm, it glowed like a lighthouse of industry. Oil lamps flickered from every window. Shadows moved methodically behind the glass, silhouettes hunched at looms or walking narrow paths with mechanical discipline. To the townsfolk, it was simply proof of Chamberlain's legendary productivity. But to Caleb Craraven, peering through his attic spyglass, it looked more like a machine that ran on something deeper than steam or sweat. He hadn't stopped watching since the night he'd seen the line of people marched at gunpoint to the shed. Something terrible had happened that night. He could feel it in his chest. The abandoned storage building, the still chimneys of the company housing, the way the wagons left just before sunrise and returned with their wheels eerily clean. They weren't accidents. And then there was the shoe. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Tiny, worn by a child no older than his cousin Elsie. The carved initials M.E. A name, maybe, or a desperate mark made in fear. He had hidden the shoe beneath the floorboards in his bedroom, as if afraid it might vanish if left in the open, as if someone might come looking for it. On the morning the storm lifted, Caleb made a decision. While most of Gallatin shoveled snow and checked on neighbors, he crept across the frozen yard and approached the mill grounds. His boots crunched over glassy drifts. The red walls of the mill loomed ahead, still steaming from the heat within. He slipped past the main fence, sticking to the tree line until he reached the storage shed. The door was ajar, swinging slightly. In the breeze, inside the space was scrubbed to sterile perfection to clean. The wooden floor gleamed with lye, and the air reeked of soap and chemical burn. Nothing remained of the group he'd seen escorted here. No bedding, no crates, not even footprints in the dust. But Caleb had learned to look closer. He moved slowly along the walls, knelt by a warped board, and pried it up. There it was. The second clue. Another child's item this time. A threadbare mitten, buried beneath the planks as if hidden in a hurry. He turned it over. No name, no carving. But it was enough to confirm what his instincts already screamed. Someone had tried to erase people from this place. He ran home through the melting snow, breath fogging in the cold, mind racing. But no sooner had he burst into the kitchen, mitt in hand, than a knock came at the door. His mother answered, and standing on the porch, framed in cold daylight and exhaling frost from perfectly shaped lips, was Jeremiah Chamberlain. His smile was warm, his eyes were ice. "Good morning, Mrs. Craraven," he said, removing his hat with a gentleman's grace. "I was just passing through and thought I might speak with your husband." Thomas came forward slowly. "We weren't expecting visitors." "No one ever expects opportunity," Chamberlain replied smoothly. "May I?" He entered like a man accustomed to welcome, settled in the parlor chair as if it belonged to him. He pulled a folder from his coat, full of tidy papers and freshly inked contracts. His tone remained pleasant, almost lazy. "I have a proposal," he began, eyeing Thomas as he spoke. "I'm expanding the mill. I'll need the strip of land along the creek where young Caleb likes to fish, I believe." Margaret Craraven's face tightened. "That land's been in our family for 30 years. I'm prepared to pay $500 for it. Gold." Thomas blinked. That was 3 years' income for them, more than enough to repair the barn, hire help, and survive another winter without worry. But something in Chamberlain's smile made his stomach twist. "That's generous," he said slowly. We're not selling. The change was subtle but immediate. Chamberlain's grin didn't falter, yet the room's temperature seemed to drop. The oil lamp beside him flickered unnaturally, casting long shadows across the wall. I understand sentimental attachment, he murmured, but the future doesn't care about sentiment. My mill is the future. And I'd hate to see anyone left behind. Margaret's voice was sharp. Are you threatening us, Mr. Chamberlain? He chuckled softly. Heavens, no. Just offering perspective. Take the Hendersons, for instance. Lovely family. They were quite attached to their land, too, until young James had that hunting accident. Tragic, changed everything. Silence fell like ash in the parlor. James Henderson had died 6 months earlier. Everyone believed it was an accident. Caleb stared at the man seated across from them, a pit yawning open in his chest. Thomas nodded stiffly. I'll think about it. Please do, Chamberlain said, rising. But remember, chances don't often come twice. He left without another word. His boots left no trace in the softening snow. 3 days later, the land was sold, but gold coins gleamed on their dining table like cursed treasure. Margaret didn't speak for hours. Thomas stared at the ground. Caleb said nothing, but he was already planning that something inside him had changed. His fear had calcified into resolve. He began taking longer routes to school, climbing trees for better views of the mill, drawing crude maps, watching the guards, the wagons, the light patterns. He logged details in a battered journal, hidden beneath loose floorboards, using a code only he understood. He watched workers arrive, always in groups, always strangers. And he watched them vanish just as quietly. One evening in March, he saw a young couple arrive with 2 small children, tired but grateful, shaking hands with Chamberlain himself. Within 2 weeks, their cabin was empty. The pattern was forming. The mill didn't just consume cotton, it consumed people. By the time spring began to thaw the frost and turn the fields green again, Caleb's notes listed 14 disappearances, who had simply blinked out of existence. Each one followed a rhythm: arrival, brief employment, nighttime procession, canvas-covered wagons, and always. The mill never slept. But no one in town would listen. The sheriff was grateful for Chamberlain's investment. The mayor was his friend. The newspaper called the mill a symbol of recovery. And so, it fell to a boy with sharp eyes and a sharper sense of justice, who saw what others refused to see. The Chamberlain cotton mill was hiding something beneath its gears and grit, and Caleb Craraven had only just begun to uncover it. Spring rolled into Tennessee like a slow breath after a long fever. The river thawed. The hills bloomed. Soldiers passed through Gallatin less frequently, and some dared to speak of peace, even if only in whispers. But inside the heart of Bledsoe Valley, the Chamberlain cotton mill continued to hum, relentless, tireless, deaf to the seasons. To the people of Gallatin, it was a miracle of modern productivity. It churned out thousands of yards of cotton, fulfilling Union military contracts like clockwork. Money flowed, houses were rebuilt, and the town began to swell with cautious optimism. Yet not everyone celebrated. For Caleb Craraven, spring brought no comfort. His maps of the mill grounds had grown more detailed. His codebook scrawled in the margins of old-school primers was now thick with names, dates, sketches of wagons, and guards. He was recording something no one else dared acknowledge. People were still vanishing, refugees arrived, and then, weeks later, they were gone. On the surface, Chamberlain's business remained spotless. His foremen were polite. Workers were paid. Company housing was kept tidy. But there were things that didn't add up. No one got mail. No one sent mail. The postmaster, Sarah Poole Jennings, once mentioned to Caleb's mother over tea that it was strange that so many new workers had no family left to write to. And Dr. Henley, the town's only physician, quietly admitted to Thomas Craraven that he'd never been called to treat a single injury from the mill. Not even a broken finger. And then came the arrival of the Sutton family. It was mid-April when Caleb saw the wagon turn off the main road and head up toward the mill gates. The family rode with the weary stiffness of people who'd seen too much war. A father, broad-shouldered and hollow-eyed, a mother with wind-burned cheeks and clenched hands, 3 daughters, a boy no older than 8, but it was the eldest girl who made Caleb's breath catch. Rebecca Sutton, 16, proud chin, dark hair tied in a braid like a soldier's rope. Caleb remembered her from Hartsville church gatherings before the raids scattered half the congregation. She had sung in the choir, she had once borrowed his fishing rod, and now she was walking into the lion's den. He knew how this would end. Within 2 months, he told himself they'd vanish like the others. And this time, he couldn't just watch. Caleb increased his surveillance. He skipped school. He slept during the day and crept through the trees at night, watching the mill from every angle. He began leaving small markers near the workers' cabins, piled pebbles, bent twigs, secret signs only Rebecca might notice. He waited for her to respond. Then one afternoon near the well behind the cabins, he found it. A piece of torn cloth, wrapped around a stone. Inside, a note, scrawled in hurried pencil. "Who are you? What do you know?" It was unsigned, but he recognized the neat, angular script from an old hymn book she had once carried. She'd seen the signs. She was listening. He wrote back, "You're in danger. Don't trust Chamberlain. Watch the wagons. Stay away from the shed." And so, over the next few days, their secret correspondence grew. Messages hidden under porch steps, tucked in cracks of the well frame, buried under the chicken feed. Caleb told her what he had seen, what he had discovered, about the disappearances, the wagons, the child's shoe, and she believed him. Rebecca began asking questions at the mill, careful, casual questions. Where had the Petersons gone? Weren't the Crawleys due back? Had anyone heard from the Tanners? Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp. Too sharp. Word reached Chamberlain's inner circle. On June 15, 1864, as dusk fell over Gallatin, Caleb was perched in his tree above the creek when he saw the first signs of danger. 2 armed men flanked the Sutton family's cabin, then 4, then 6. Rifles, torches, a knock at the door, yelling, a scuffle. And then, in the failing light, the Suttons were marched like prisoners toward the back of the mill. Rebecca fought. He could hear her voice, even from the distance, screaming her siblings' names, crying for her mother. Her father's head hung low. Her brother stumbled. And then the door to the basement opened. They were swallowed into the darkness. Caleb's hands trembled on the branch. He almost fell. He wanted to run home, to scream, to charge the mill with nothing but fury in his fists. But he knew better. If he was to save them, he had to be smarter than that. So that night, he returned to the storage shed. He snuck through the mill grounds like a shadow, slipping past the guards, the dogs, the lantern posts. He reached the back entrance on an old maintenance door, half buried by vines. It creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, he found what he feared. Cells. Real cells. Iron bars. Heavy locks. Chains on the walls. And something worse. A room that looked like a surgical theater. A long metal table. Glass jars filled with things too horrible to name. Shelves of books. Vials, surgical instruments. In the corner was a filing cabinet. He opened it. Inside were records, dozens of them. Each file bore a name, a date of hire, a description, age, gender, physical traits, and a final line, subject X, status, expired. The words felt like ice pressed to his spine. Subject 23, John Patterson, age 34, endurance testing, expired after 72 hours. Subject 31, Mary Collins, immunity exposure, deceased after 2 weeks. Subject 41, David Reynolds, dissection complete. He shut the drawer. His hands were slick with sweat. In a final hallway, he saw a flicker of movement, someone still alive, still fighting. He crept toward it, and there, behind rusted bars, sat Rebecca Sutton, hair matted, lips split, but eyes burning. "Caleb," she whispered. He nodded. "I'm getting you out." But Rebecca wasn't crying. She wasn't broken. She held something tightly in her lap, pages torn from a leather-bound book. "I found it," she said. "His journal. Chamberlain's. It has everything. Names, money, letters. They're selling people to doctors. They're selling people to doctors. They're experimenting on them." Caleb felt his heart seize. "We need to move," he said. "Now, no," she replied. "We don't run. We stop this. All of it." The girl who once sang hymns now spoke like fire. She hadn't given up, and neither would he. The mill had always whispered. At night, when most of Gallatin fell silent, the sounds leaking from its red brick walls grew stranger. Not the hum of looms or the clank of pulleys. No, what drifted across Bledsoe Creek in the midnight wind were low cries, the screech of metal dragged across stone, and sometimes something like sobbing. Caleb Craraven had stopped sleeping after he found Rebecca in that rusting sun, fierce and clutching evidence that could ruin Jeremiah Chamberlain. His purpose crystallized like frost in morning light. This wasn't just about watching anymore. It was about stopping something monstrous. He'd slipped away from the basement that night with the stolen pages hidden under his coat and a plan forming in his head. But plans, he realized, were hard to build in a town wrapped in silence. No one in Gallatin would believe him. Even if they did, what could they do? Chamberlain had bought loyalty with gold and fear in equal measure. The sheriff owed him campaign funds. The mayor called him a visionary. Even the Reverend had recently praised Chamberlain's Christian work ethic from the pulpit. The man was untouchable, so Caleb turned to the only thing he had left, Rebecca. Next day she managed to slip him a torn envelope, smuggled out by a sympathetic kitchen worker, and left beneath a tree root. Inside were more pages from Chamberlain's journal ledgers listing payment for experimental materials sent to doctors in Charleston, Atlanta, even New Orleans. Numbers, names, descriptions of human test subjects. One chilling line read, subject, 58, female, 16, high resilience, ideal candidate for surgical conditioning, monitor closely for psychological resistance. They were watching her, studying her, planning to carve her up like a medical specimen. Caleb's fists clenched. He doubled his surveillance. Every night, he watched from the trees or crawled between the mill's storage buildings. Every day he plotted escape routes, traced maps through haylofts and drainage tunnels. He even faked sickness to skip school, using the time to sketch blueprints and chart guard rotations. One evening, while hidden beneath the wheelhouse, he overheard two men talking, both drunk on moonshine and false confidence. They're closing it down soon. One slurred, Yankee inspection team coming from Nashville. Chamberlain's got 30 days to burn it all evidence files. Subjects, the whole damn place. The other man grunted, then we'll be out of a job. Better that than locked up for what we've done down there. Caleb didn't breathe until they left. He didn't sleep that night, or the next. On the third day, he returned to the basement. Not to rescue Rebecca yet, but to confirm what he'd heard. He entered through the same hidden drainage hatch near the creek. A rusted tunnel barely wide enough for a child. He emerged, beneath the mill, into a nightmare of medical horror. The surgical rooms were active now. Metal tables gleamed under oil lanterns. Buckets sat beneath them filled with fluids and blood. A line of jars displayed pale organs suspended in liquid, each labeled with hand-scratched initials and notes. In the next chamber, Caleb found an incinerator, a great iron maw where documents and unusable materials were burned. The air smelled of char and chemicals. He opened the hatch. Inside, partially scorched, was a sheet of names. 20-6 in total, all marked deceased. He stuffed the page into his coat and moved. On. In the far corridor, past a locked door, he heard murmuring faint voices, barely human. The other prisoners, the ones Rebecca had mentioned, still alive. For now, Caleb turned to leave and found himself face to face with Dr. Marcus Hensley, the town physician. Only now, dressed in blood-splattered linens and gloves slick with some awful procedure, he looked like something from a butcher's tale. He froze when he saw the boy, blinking in disbelief. Hensley gasped. Caleb didn't hesitate. He hurled a glass vial from the shelf at the oil lamp on the wall. Flames erupted. Hensley screamed, and Caleb ran. Smoke followed him like a spirit. He crawled back into the drainage tunnel as shouting erupted behind him. The flames had caught. He hadn't meant to set the room ablaze, but he hadn't meant to walk in on a murder either. Back at home, Thomas and Margaret Craraven saw the scorch marks on his coat, the soot on his face. They didn't ask questions, because they already knew. Thomas pulled his son into the barn that night and shut the doors. You found something, didn't you? He asked. Caleb nodded. They're killing people, testing them. Rebecca found a journal. We have proof. His father sat down heavily. And you think someone will care? They will if we get it to Nashville. The army's sending inspectors. Thomas sighed. You're 13, son. You're brave, but this is bigger than you. I'm not doing it alone, Caleb replied. Rebecca's still inside. We're going to get everyone out. His father looked at him, not with doubt but with the weary knowledge of a man who'd lived long enough to understand consequences. Then we'll help, he said. Margaret, who had been listening outside the barn, stepped inside. She held out a small box, Caleb's spyglass, the old family revolver, a map drawn decades ago of the original mill plans. I can sew pages into your jacket lining, she said. They won't find them if they search you. They were no longer bystanders. The Cravens had joined the rebellion. The next night, Rebecca's next message came, slipped into Caleb's coat pocket by a girl from the laundry. It was only 2 words, tomorrow, midnight. That was all he needed. Caleb met her in the basement corridor, having crept through the tunnel again. This time, he carried a satchel with food, rope, maps, and the revolver. He didn't feel heroic. He felt afraid. But he also felt ready. Rebecca was waiting, her hair braided tight, eyes glowing with iron. We've got a route, she whispered. A tunnel that leads to the creek. But we'll need to move everyone fast. The guards rotate every 12 minutes. If we time it right, we can get them out. How many are there? Caleb asked. 37, Caleb whistled low. We'll need a miracle. No, Rebecca said, pressing the stolen journal pages into his hand. "We just need a story worth dying for." And in that moment, two children made a pact that would alter the fate of every soul trapped in the belly of the Chamberlain cotton mill. The final hours before a rebellion don't sound like gunfire or marching boots, they sound like breath held too long, like footsteps softened with caution, like whispered prayers drifting through stone walls and dust. At 2:47 a.m. on the night of July 22nd, 1864, the heart of the Chamberlain cotton mill beat steadily beneath its red-bricked skin. Upstairs, the looms still hummed under dim lanterns, though no fabric had been woven for hours. Downstairs, hidden below layers of locked doors and silence, Caleb Craraven and Rebecca Sutton stood before a row of rusted cells, keys trembling in hand, as if they were about to wake ghosts. "This is it," Caleb whispered, holding the first cell key like a lit match. Rebecca nodded. "We're getting out, all of us tonight." The first lock clacked open. Inside, two women sat slumped in a corner, eyes wide with disbelief. One clutched a bundle of cloth too small to be anything but a child. Another door swung open. Then another. Gasps turned to murmurs. Murmurs into tears. They moved fast, quiet, but fast. Rebecca led the way, cradling Chamberlain's journal pages in a waterproof pouch beneath her blouse. Caleb handed out bits of bread, pieces of dried meat, canteens of water. Some prisoners could barely walk, others carried the weak. All moved with the silent terror of people who had stopped believing in rescue. But the deeper they crept through the corridors, the more fragile the plan became. Rebecca's escape route hinged on two things: the guard's shift, change which happened every 12 minutes, and a drainage tunnel that led from the basement to Bledsoe Creek, a maintenance passage, narrow and wet, never intended for people. But if they could reach it, it would carry them outside the compound and into the woods. It was their only shot. Caleb peeled away from the group, climbing a ladder into the west corridor of the basement, where a supply room lay filled with surgical documents and jars of preserved horror. His mission: light the fire. He worked quickly. Lamp oil spilled across shelving, straw piled at the door, flint struck against steel. The first explosion of flame came moments later, erupting through the mill's underbelly like a warning bell. From hell, alarms shouted through the building. Guards thundered down stairwells. Caleb sprinted back toward the others, his lungs filling with smoke, the world flickering orange and red. "Now," he barked. "Go, go." Rebecca led the group through the winding halls to the tunnel entrance, a narrow brick archway half choked with sludge and water. It stank of rot and damp, but it was freedom. Prisoners dropped to their knees and began crawling, one after another. But their window was shrinking. Above, the fire spread fast, too fast. The oil-soaked corridors became a living inferno. Screams of guards echoed across the basement. Somewhere, Dr. Hensley bellowed orders: "Seal the exits, kill any survivors." A shot rang out. Caleb ducked instinctively. One of the escapees, a boy no older than feet, and crumpled beside him. He didn't stop. He dragged the next woman into the tunnel and shoved her forward. "Keep going. Don't stop." Smoke blackened the air. Flames licked at the wooden beams. Overhead, the mill groaned, as if something ancient inside it were cracking open. Just as the last of the escapees entered the tunnel, a figure stepped into the firelit hallway. William Garrett, the mill foreman, rifle raised. "You little rat," he hissed. "You think this ends with you?" Caleb dove behind a cabinet. The bullet missed by inches, splintering the wall. He scrambled, grabbing the only weapon he had, a jar of clear liquid from the surgical shelves. He hurled it toward the lantern. It shattered. Fire bloomed instantly, engulfing the room in a whoosh of heat and brightness. Garrett screamed, flailing as flames clung to his uniform. Caleb didn't look back. He ran. By the time he dropped into the tunnel, coughing and slick with sweat, Rebecca was waiting at the other end, ankle-deep in creek water, clutching her brother to her chest. "Where's the ledger?" she asked. Caleb opened his coat. The bundle was there, Chamberlain's personal ledger, charred around the edges, but intact. And inside it, tucked in a rusted strongbox he'd grabbed just before fleeing, were letters signed by Union Army medical officers, proof of their involvement, their purchases, their complicity. It was enough to burn down more than just the mill, that could destroy everything Chamberlain had built. The group gathered by the creek, gasping, crying, coughing. 37 people, some barefoot, some bleeding, all alive. Behind them, the Chamberlain cotton mill blazed like a pyre, its red brick walls glowing, collapsing inward in places, belching black smoke into the pre-dawn sky. Rebecca turned to the others. "We run. To the county seat. It's 10 miles. Stopping, no talking. We get to the sheriff. We show them what we have. Caleb coughed and nodded. There's a judge in Hartsville. Her uncle. We bring this to her. Together. They started moving, limping, stumbling, supporting each other down the wooded trails, away from the roaring fire, away from the blood-soaked building that had masqueraded as industry. But Caleb looked back one last time, and in the flickering blaze, silhouetted against the second-floor window, stood a man in a black coat, calm still, Jeremiah Chamberlain, watching, smiling, and then he vanished behind the flames. They never found his body. The fire at the Chamberlain cotton mill raged until dawn, a pillar of smoke and flame that could be seen for miles. By the time townsfolk arrived with buckets and shovels, it was already too late. The main building had collapsed inward, a blackened skeleton of scorched brick and twisted beams. The cotton looms, once symbols of prosperity, lay melted and warped. The compound, which had buzzed with activity for over a year, was now a silent, steaming ruin. But the fire hadn't just taken machinery, it had destroyed the evidence at least. That's what Chamberlain had counted on. What he hadn't planned for was who got out, and what they carried with them by mid-morning. Caleb Craraven and Rebecca Sutton, suits streaked and blistered, arrived with 35 other survivors at the Gallatin courthouse, where Sheriff Ellis Baines was just finishing his breakfast. He looked up from his plate of eggs and nearly choked. "Good Lord," he muttered, rising as the battered group entered. "What in heaven's name?" "Shut the doors," Rebecca snapped, her voice once soft and sweet at church social, now ragged and commanding. "Get the judge, call the army post in Nashville, and take this." She slammed a charred leather book onto his desk, Chamberlain's ledger. Ellis stared at the survivors. Some were barefoot, others bandaged in rags. All had the same haunted look in their eyes, like people who had seen behind the curtain of something ancient and foul. "What is this?" he asked, gently opening the book. "A record of murder," Caleb said, "and experiments. Government-funded. Chamberlain was supplying bodies to doctors across the South. Workers were disappearing. We have names, dates. We have the names of Army officers involved." The sheriff flipped through the entries, each marked with clean, precise ink. Subject 58. Sutton, our physical resilience confirmed. High-value subject. He looked up at Rebecca, pale with shock. "I need a wire," she said. "To Nashville, to Colonel James Mitchell. Tell him everything, now." Baines didn't hesitate. By sundown, 3 companies of Union troops had arrived in Gallatin. Colonel Mitchell, gray-bearded, granite voice, read through the ledger with fury burning in his eyes. "My brother," he muttered, jaw tightening. "He took a job at Chamberlain's mill last October. Disappeared in December. No word since." Caleb stepped forward and opened his notebook, pages of coded entries translated into plain names and times. He flipped to December. Subject 67, Mitchell, our male, 32. Labor detail. Disposed of after 10 days. The colonel turned pale, and from that moment, the tide turned. Within 48 hours, an official federal investigation was launched. The survivors gave testimony, sworn statements recorded by candlelight. Caleb's journal was added to the evidence pile. Rebecca's torn pages from Chamberlain's personal writings were handed over. The truth spilled like blood from a reopened wound. What emerged horrified even the most hardened military men. Chamberlain had been running a covert human experimentation ring under the guise of industrial production. The mill served as both prison and laboratory, with captured workers used in chemical testing, surgical trials, and endurance studies. Records showed that at least 73 individuals had been killed and buried in unmarked graves along the Cumberland River. Some of those graves were still fresh. A team was dispatched to the site. They returned with grim confirmation. Rows of simple wooden stakes marked with numbers, beneath them decomposing remains. One body wore a child's shoe with the initials M.E. carved inside the sole. Caleb stood silently as they uncovered it, jaw clenched, eyes full of fire. "That's what started all this," he murmured. Rebecca squeezed his hand. She didn't speak, but her presence was a lifeline. Across the South, news of the mill's horrors spread, and as federal investigators dug deeper, they discovered that the Chamberlain mill was only one of several. Similar manufacturing centers had sprung up in Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina, all funded by shady government contracts, all with ledgers full of carefully erased names. Doctors were arrested in Charleston, in Atlanta, in New Orleans. And among the names uncovered in Chamberlain's correspondence were Union Army medical officers, officials who had purchased research, data, and preserved human samples for medical advancement. Trials began that August. Courtrooms were packed. Survivors testified for hours. Caleb stood tall before the jury, his voice shaking but clear. "I saw the wagons," he said. "They left at night, came back empty, always after a disappearance." Rebecca read from Chamberlain's journal, her voice breaking only once. Subject: 63, family of 5. Suitable for isolation testing. Begin separation protocol. Monitor mental strain. When she sat down, the room was silent. Not even the judge blinked. Guilty verdicts came swiftly. Dr. Marcus Hensley was captured near Charleston, hiding under a false name. He confessed in exchange for leniency but received a life sentence in military prison. 2 Union officers, Colonel Morrison and Major Lyle, were court-martialed and executed for war crimes. The 73 victims from the Cumberland River were reaped in Gallatin City Cemetery, beneath a monument that read, "In memory of those who died in pursuit of false progress. May their silence never be repeated." As for Jeremiah Chamberlain, he had disappeared into the fire, or so it seemed. No body was found in the wreckage. No trace, no remains. Rumors swirled. Some believed he escaped to Europe. Others whispered he had changed his face, started over. The mystery only deepened when construction began years later on a new courthouse built on the old mill site, and under its foundation, in a sealed chamber, they found him. It was a gray September morning in 1887, over 2 decades since the fire consumed the Chamberlain cotton mill, when the truth finally rose from the earth. Work crews clearing the lot for the new Gallatin courthouse struck something unexpected. Beneath the old mill's foundations a hollow echo, like shovel against iron. At first, they thought it was a drainage vault, but as they dug deeper, what emerged was a sealed stone chamber, reinforced with steel, and buried under 3 feet of compacted soil. No blueprints showed it, no records mentioned it, and it hadn't been touched in 23 years. Inside, they found the body, a man, mid-50s, well-preserved, dressed in a black wool overcoat with gold trim and polished boots. His hands were folded over his chest. A gold pocket watch rested in his vest. Beside him sat a metal strongbox, a leather satchel, and several bundles of tightly wrapped documents. The body was untouched by fire. Medical examiners confirmed what became Gallatin's worst-kept secret. The man was Jeremiah Chamberlain. Hadn't escaped. He had been murdered, a single bullet wound behind his right ear, close range, execution style. The town fell silent. He had vanished so completely, for so long that many believed he'd reinvented himself elsewhere. But no, he had died in that fire, just not from it. Someone had killed him, hidden the body beneath the mill, and buried the truth with it. The newspapers screamed justice unearthed. But the real revelation wasn't his corpse, it was the letter clutched in his hand, addressed to whomever dares dig deep enough. The handwriting was his, stained in sweat, but legible. It read, "I have been betrayed by those who once profited from my work, Dr. Hensley, Colonel Morrison. They fear I will expose them now that an investigation looms. They think my death will end their danger. They are wrong. I've hidden copies of everything. This chamber holds their names, their payments, their crimes. Let this be a warning. Those who traffic in human life will always pay. Eventually, the dead have longer memories than the living." What followed was even more damning. Ledgers, letters, purchase orders, all meticulously kept. Chamberlain, it turned out, was many things: cruel, brilliant, arrogant, but never sloppy, and he wanted his enemies to go down with him. The documents recovered from the vault reopened the investigation. 23 more officials were indicted. 3 more military doctors were arrested. 1 prominent senator from Mississippi quietly resigned before charges could be filed. But the real power of the vault wasn't just in the justice it reignited. It was in the story it finalized. Now there was no doubt, no room for speculation. The Chamberlain cotton mill had not been a misunderstood wartime factory. It had been a slaughterhouse in disguise, a human experimentation hub, disguised as prosperity, masked by patriotism. And the man behind it all died alone, buried beneath the monument he built for himself. Back in Gallatin, Caleb Craraven was now 36 years old, a seasoned journalist with graying hair and a permanent squint from too many nights reading by candlelight. He had never left Tennessee, though he'd been offered posts in bigger cities. He stayed because the story wasn't finished. When the vault was uncovered, Caleb was one of the first called to the scene. He stood in the pit, staring down at Chamberlain's body, unmoving. He didn't feel triumph, he felt closier, the cold, clean kind that settles over a wound long after the bleeding stops. They say it was Hensley, the sheriff told him, or Morrison, maybe both. Caleb shrugged. Doesn't matter now. He's where he belongs. He turned away before the body was lifted. Rebecca Sutton, now Mrs. Rebecca Langford, heard the news in Philadelphia, where she'd become a prominent advocate for medical ethics legislation. Her testimony, 2 decades earlier, had helped pass the Medical Integrity Act of 1867, which mandated oversight of all human trials across the Union. She received a telegram. They found him, under the mill. Everything's confirmed. Her hands trembled as she read it. Not from fear, not from anger, just memory. She was older, now mother of 5, widowed, still burning with that sharp clarity that once helped her outwit men who thought she was disposable. That night she wrote a letter to Caleb. We always knew he hadn't gone. Father rot was too deep. It needed roots. Thank you for staying, Caleb, for watching the ground. You were the first to see it coming. A month after the discovery, the Gallatin Town Council voted to turn the land into a memorial park. The courthouse was moved. The vault was resealed, this time marked with a plaque, Jeremiah Chamberlain 1835 to 1864. Entrepreneur, visionary, monster, let history remember all his names. The original 73 victims were reburied nearby under new headstones, each inscribed with full names, dates, and recovered stories. The cemetery became a place of reflection for residents, travelers, and historians alike. Students from nearby schools visited on field trips. Reporters came every October, the month when the first disappearance was recorded, and every spring, on the anniversary of the fire, someone no one ever saw who left a single child's shoe at the base of the marker. Always the same size dot, always carved with the initials M.E. Years passed, the South changed, the war faded into textbooks, but the story of the Chamberlain cotton mill remained. Caleb continued writing, not just about Chamberlain, but about corruption, power, and the way evil often hides in the language of progress. His articles became lecture material for universities across the country. He refused every award offered to him. Don't thank me, he once said. I just paid attention. He died at 93, in the house where he was born, surrounded by letters, journals, and clippings. He never married. He claimed the truth took up too much space in his heart. Rebecca lived longer. She spoke at his funeral. Her voice, still strong, carried across the cemetery as she read the eulogy he once wrote for the victims of the mill. The most dangerous criminals are not those who wear masks or wield knives. They are the ones who offer you employment, safety, and a future, all while digging your grave beneath your feet. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the field, and so the earth kept its secrets a little less tightly. The Chamberlain cotton mill, once the pride of Gallatin, became a symbol, a story, a warning, because history has corners darker than fiction dares go. And sometimes, it takes the eyes of a child, the voice of a survivor, and the courage of 2 unlikely heroes to shine a light deep enough. After the ashes cooled and the stories settled into law books, many believed the horror was over. Chamberlain was dead. His allies had fallen. The survivors had moved on, but the truth was never content to stay buried. 2 years after the fire, in the fall of 1866, a battered satchel was discovered in a barn outside Hartsville, abandoned after a skirmish between retreating Confederates and Union scouts. The barn had long since collapsed, swallowed by kudzu and time, but inside that satchel was something familiar. A second ledger, not Chamberlain's personal one, a master copy, one he'd intended to preserve elsewhere, hidden before the fire began. It contained a full duplicate of his original records, names, dates, experiments, payments. But it also included something new, a list of intended expansion sites, land purchases across the Deep South, and a roster of doctors, industrialists, and military officers who had expressed interest in replicating his model. The plan had always been bigger than Tennessee. He hadn't just built a slaughterhouse. He had started a franchise of evil. This discovery reignited federal attention. Investigators followed the trail south. They uncovered shuttered buildings in Savannah, Mobile, and Jackson factories that had all once been marked as cotton gins, or textile warehouses. But beneath their floors were hidden cells, medical rooms, records etched in rust and horror. Each site had been hastily abandoned. The walls still bore bloodstains. Some still smelled of chemicals and antiseptic. They found the remains of 19 people in a submerged storage vault in Mississippi, bones packed into crates, many labeled with initials and numbers. One of the crates held a tag, Subject 114, Alabama Immune System Resilience Study, status harvest complete. The chain of depravity stretched farther than anyone had imagined, and the names in the second ledger told a darker story still. Men who had never been punished, men who had covered their tracks, men who now sat on university boards, owned newspapers, or ran shipping companies. In 1867, The federal government created a special tribunal to track and prosecute any remaining collaborators of the Chamberlain network. The newly formed Office for Wartime Medical Oversight began combing through hospital records, academic research, and shipping manifests across the South. They found code words embedded in supply invoices, cotton specimens, organic freight, long-term test stock, innocent phrases that had masked human cargo. A doctor in Charleston, praised for his work in post-war fever outbreaks, was arrested for performing unsanctioned surgeries on freedmen and orphans. His research had been funded by Chamberlain, a rail magnate in Atlanta, was revealed to have built secret compartments in train cars to move prisoners between mills. A Union major had provided forged documentation to smuggle subjects through military checkpoints. The rot had infected every level, but for Caleb Craraven, now in his 20s and writing for the Gallatin Register, the second ledger was more than just proof of a wider conspiracy. It was unfinished business. One name in particular drew his attention. Augustus Bellamy, a wealthy industrialist from Savannah. Bellamy had been listed as a potential investor in Chamberlain South, the second mill project scheduled to open in early 1865. Had the original operation not gone up in flames, Bellamy had never been charged. His name had quietly disappeared from the investigation when his lawyer cooperated with military prosecutors. But Caleb, with the obsessive tenacity of someone who had once watched wagons vanish into mist, wasn't satisfied. He traveled to Savannah with a copy of the second ledger tucked into his coat. There he found Bellamy's mansion untouched by war-white columns, manicured hedges, servants who watched visitors with cold eyes. The man himself, now in his 50s, still hosted lectures on the future of Southern innovation. He'd published a book titled Healing Through Industry, a vision for post-war America. Inside the book, Caleb found footnotes, ideas that echoed Chamberlain's phrases, concepts about controlled subject populations and data acquisition. From transient laborers, it was sanitized language, but the mask was thin. One evening, after waiting near the estate gates for hours, Caleb approached him. "You knew what Chamberlain was doing," he said. "You gave him money. I have your letters." Bellamy laughed. "My boy, what do you think war is? Civilization's greatest laboratory. If we didn't ask the questions he was asking, someone else would. You'd think experimenting on children was a question. I think it was a tragedy," Bellamy replied smoothly, "but not without its lessons." That was all Caleb needed. The next morning, the Gallatin Register printed a front-page column titled, "The Second Ledger." Names that history forgot to shame. The article detailed Bellamy's correspondence, his planned investment, and excerpts from his book. That it sparked an uproar. Within weeks, Bellamy was called to testify before a special ethics committee in Washington. Though he was never convicted, his reputation collapsed. His businesses were boycotted. His book was pulled from shelves. He died 2 years later, alone, in a hospital room funded by the very research he'd once defended. Caleb never gloated, but he kept the second ledger under lock and key, wrapped in oiled cloth, placed inside a fireproof safe in his office. He didn't want revenge. He wanted memory. Rebecca, still working in Philadelphia, received a copy of the article. She read it aloud to her children, 4 boys and a girl. When she reached the passage about healing through industry, her hands shook with fury. That night she wrote Caleb, "You were right. It wasn't over. Thank you for lighting the second fire. Let's keep it burning." She spent the next year lobbying for an expansion of the Medical Integrity Act. Her push led to the Ethical Research Charter of 1868, which made it illegal to conduct human trials without federal review, written consent, and published results. Violators could now be charged with crimes against humanity. The Chamberlain cotton mill was gone. Its walls had crumbled. Its tools were rust. But the evil it birthed had tried to grow again, branching out like a fungus in shadowed corners of progress. And it was stopped not by armies or laws, but by memory. By documents that wouldn't burn. By 2 young people who refused to let silence win. By 1869, the official investigations had slowed. The war was over, Reconstruction was underway, and the country, tired of blood and scandal, turned its gaze toward rebuilding railroads and rewriting futures. The Chamberlain cases, though explosive, at the time, faded into legal texts and lecture halls. But in Gallatin, the past wasn't so easily buried, not when so many of its victims still lay beneath unmarked earth. 73 wooden stakes had once stood along the banks of Bledsoe Creek, each one numbered, pounded into the frozen soil during a different season, a different year. They weren't graves in the traditional sense. There were no names, no markers, just numbers and silence. And for Caleb Craraven, silence had never been enough. He knew many of the original markers were long gone, washed away by rain, burned by accident, or erased by design. But his old journals, coupled with Chamberlain's ledgers and Rebecca's pages, contained a master list, names matched to dates, notes cross-referenced with coded entries that it was time. Caleb proposed a project through the Gallatin Historical Society, a full exhumation and identification of every known burial site tied to the Chamberlain mill. The city council hesitated. It would cost money, it would stir ghosts, but public pressure, bolstered by years of advocacy from survivors, forced a vote. The motion passed. That autumn, shovels met soil. The first graves were shallow. Most yielded only fragments, clumps of cloth, bone shards, a boot sole with initials carved into it. But others were nearly intact. A woman in a faded dress, a boy still clutching the corner of a quilt, a man with carpenter's calluses still visible on skeletal fingers. Each discovery hurt. Each one confirmed what Caleb already knew. These weren't abstract victims. They were people. They had names, stories, families. Many had once arrived at the mill believing they'd found safety. The hardest moment came on a windy October afternoon when a pair of diggers uncovered the remains of a child, no more than 5, curled in fetal position, leather shoes still tied neatly. Inside the insole, M.E., the initials that had started it all, the initials Caleb had found carved into a child's shoe during the blizzard of 1863. He knelt beside the grave, heart stuttering. There had been questions back then: who the child was, where she'd come from, why her disappearance was never reported. Now, nearly 7 years later, she had a name: Mary Eleanor Winslow. Her family records showed had fled Nashville in 1862 and arrived at the Chamberlain mill in early February 1863. Chamberlain's own notes had dismissed the family as low-profile ideal candidates. They vanished within 3 weeks. Caleb stood, jaw tight. The air smelled of wet leaves and loss. "We're going to give her a proper nameplate," he said to the workers. "A proper grave. And then we're doing the same for every single one." The project lasted 2 years. With help from forensic teams, volunteers, and surviving family members, 61 of the original 73 bodies were identified. Each was reburied in Gallatin City Cemetery. Their new headstones lined up along the eastern ridge beneath a row of young oak trees. The cemetery became something more than a resting place. It became a monument. The community held a dedication ceremony on the 7th anniversary of the fire. Over 300 people attended: survivors, descendants, clergy, Union veterans, and children too young to remember Chamberlain but old enough to carry the warning forward. Rebecca Sutton Langford gave the keynote address, now in her 30s, wearing a deep green shawl and standing beside her youngest son. She spoke not with tears, but with strength. These people were not lost. They were stolen. Their names were not forgotten, they were erased. But today, we've written them back into history. A hush fell. Caleb followed her to the podium, thinner than before, with gray streaks in his beard and the tired eyes of a man who had spent most of his life digging where others looked away. "I was 12 when I saw the first wagon," he began. "I didn't know what I was seeing, I just knew it was wrong. It took me too long to speak, but I've been speaking ever since." He paused, voice trembling slightly. "We say history repeats itself, but only if we let it. These names, these stones are our responsibility, not just to mourn, but to remember why they were taken, and who let it happen." That night, candles were lit along every headstone. Children placed flowers. Survivors held hands. And for the first time in decades, Gallatin felt whole. But even then, the story wasn't quite finished. In the course of the burial project, Caleb discovered something peculiar. Among Chamberlain's records was an envelope, addressed only with 2 initials, RS, inside, folded 3 times. Was a single page, not a ledger or receipt, but a letter, handwritten, private, unsent, to the girl with fire in her eyes. "I underestimated you. I thought fear would silence you, that you would crumble like so many others. But you were never one of them. If I had met you in another world, perhaps I would have offered you partnership instead of captivity. You saw what I was trying to do, and unlike the others, you understood what it meant. That progress demands sacrifice, that knowledge isn't born from comfort, but pain. But your courage was louder than my ambition, and now, I suspect, you will become something far more dangerous than me. Remembered." J.C. Caleb brought it to Rebecca. She read it once, then again, then, without a word, she threw it into her fireplace. "He doesn't get the last word," she said. Later that winter, Caleb wrote one final editorial in the Register, beneath the title, The last unmarked grave, he wrote. There is one grave we did not mark, not because we couldn't find it, but because we chose not to. His name is known, his crimes are proven, his legacy is ashes. But for all his power, Jeremiah Chamberlain could not outlast the truth. It buried him in the very foundation he laid. And so his grave remains hidden, unnamed, not out of mercy, but justice. Let the stones belong to the innocent. Years passed, Gallatin changed, the mills never returned. The foundations of Chamberlain's empire were repurposed into green space, eventually giving way to Smoke Tree Memorial Park, named not for the fire that ended it all, but for the trees that began growing from the scarred soil not long after the last brick was cleared. Each spring, the smoke trees burst into wild violet bloom, their tendrils twisting toward the sky like prayers. Locals believed the land was finally healing, but for Caleb Craraven, healing had always been complicated. By 1874, he was no longer the boy who spied through a frosted attic window. He had become a chronicler, a reluctant guardian of memory. His articles had helped shape post-war policy. His notes were cited in courtrooms, classrooms, and even the halls of Washington. Yet, despite his impact, Caleb remained a quiet figure, choosing solitude over celebration, reflection over recognition. He still lived in the same weather-worn farmhouse outside town, just beyond the bend of Bledsoe Creek, where the water never stopped murmuring. And though the cemetery was no longer marked by stakes, he visited it often, not out of obligation, out of presence. Some memories, he believed, needed to be sat beside. One evening in late March, with the smoke trees just beginning to bud, a knock came at Caleb's door. He opened it to find a girl, maybe 14, hair tied back, a journal under one arm, dirt on her boots. "You're Caleb Craraven?" she asked. He nodded. She offered the journal. "My grandmother said I should bring you this." He took it, frowning at the familiar initials stitched into the leather binding, RSL, Rebecca Sutton Langford. Inside, a note in her script. "Caleb, if you're reading this, I've passed, but I never forgot. Not the mill, not the names, and not you. My granddaughter, Ada, wants to learn. I've told her all I could, but you have the rest. Don't let the next chapter be written without a witness. Love always." Caleb's breath caught. He pressed the journal to his chest. Rebecca was gone. He hadn't seen her in 5 years. Their last letter exchange had been full of hope, talk of policy shifts, lectures, grandchildren, but now her voice came through in the trembling script of a final message. He looked down at the girl. Ada had her eyes, that same fierce steadiness, that quiet insistence. "You want to know the real story?" he asked. She nodded, and so he invited her in. Over the next few months, Ada returned weekly. She listened. She asked smart, sharp questions, and she filled her own notebook's pages of notes, sketches, timelines. She wasn't just interested in what happened. She wanted to understand why. One day, she asked, why did people let it happen? The mill, the disappearances. How could no one stop it sooner? Caleb stared at the floorboards for a long time. Then he said, "People are afraid to admit how much they benefit from not looking. It's easier to pretend the system works when you don't ask who it's chewing up." Ada nodded slowly. "You think it could happen again?" He looked up. "It already has, just not here, not yet." That silence settled like a stone between them. By summer, Ada had turned 16 and begun preparing for university. She'd been accepted into Howard, where she planned to study history and law. Her final project, a detailed retelling of the Chamberlain cotton mill case, framed not just as a Southern tragedy, but as a blueprint for how institutions disguise cruelty and bureaucracy. Before she left Gallatin, Caleb walked her to the cemetery one last time. They stood beneath the smoke trees. Each grave bore a name now. Flowers had been laid, small keepsakes left behind, handwritten notes, sketches from children, a toy carved of wood. Caleb knelt beside one headstone. Mary Eleanor Winslow, 1858 to 1863, forever remembered. He reached into his coat and placed a small object beside it, the original shoe, the one that had started everything. It had been cleaned, stitched, the leather softened with care. "Been carrying it around too long," he said. "Time it stayed home." Ada stood beside him. "What about Chamberlain's grave?" she asked. "There isn't one," Caleb replied. "Not officially, but he's buried, right? Somewhere under the courthouse bricks. No marker, no record, no flowers." Ada paused, then said, "Good." They didn't say anything else for a long while. That autumn, Caleb wrote one final editorial, his last dot. It appeared on the back page of the Gallatin Register, tucked between birth announcements and crop forecasts. It begins with a ledger. Not a scream, not a body, a ledger. Rows of numbers, subjects, notes, adjustments. There's nothing loud about it. No thunderclap, just quiet decisions made in candlelight, approved, stamped, filed away. History doesn't always arrive in explosions. Sometimes, it slips in through policy, through contracts, through opportunity. And when we stop paying attention, it stays. So write it down. Remember the names. Tell the stories. Plant the trees. Let memory be the ledger that never forgets. He signed it simply. C.C. Caleb died that winter, peacefully, in his chair by the window, facing Bledsoe Creek. When the news spread, the town gathered in waves. Former survivors came, journalists, students, even quiet enemies who'd once doubted him. His coffin was carried past the smoke trees. He was buried beside the victims, not above, not apart. Among them, by his request, his headstone read, Caleb Craraven, 1851 to 1874. He saw what others didn't, and he told it. When the snow melted the spring after Caleb Craven's death, something unexpected happened in Gallatin. People started writing again, not books or articles, but letters, journals, notes, addressed to no one and everyone. Teenagers left folded pages at the base of headstones. Teachers encouraged students to research their own family trees. Survivors, once too tired to retell their pain, began recording it in trembling cursive. The Chamberlain cotton mill had become more than a horror story. It was now a mirror, and people had finally begun looking into it in Washington. Ada Langford, Rebecca's granddaughter, walked the worn marble halls of Howard University with her head held high and her notebooks worn thin. She'd arrived as a student of history, but she was becoming something else, a voice sharpened by legacy. Her final thesis, The Ledger and the Silence, was read aloud by her professor during the commencement ceremony. In it, she wrote, "When we teach atrocities, we often skip the most dangerous part, the moment they feel ordinary. Jeremiah Chamberlain didn't build a dungeon with whips and chains. He built a business model. He signed forms, approved expenses, managed inventory. Eva wore clean shirts and spoke politely. It walked through town each morning, nodded to the grocer, donated to churches. It was never a monster, it was a neighbor. And that's what makes it so terrifying." The room had fallen completely silent. Some wept. Some stood, others scribbled quotes into the margins of their own notebooks. After graduation, Ada didn't go home. She went to New York. There, she joined the staff of a radical legal journal and quickly became known for her fearlessness. Factory owners, writing pieces on child labor, medical ethics, and the blurred line between progress and predation. But what separated Ada wasn't just her sharpness, it was her origin story. Every speech she gave began the same way. "I come from the ashes of a cotton mill. My grandmother escaped it, my mentor exposed it, and I will make sure no one forgets it." Back in Gallatin, the smoke trees bloomed brighter than ever that year. Locals began calling them Caleb's trees. Children played under them. Elderly couples sat quietly on benches nearby, watching as the past no longer loomed, it lived. Carefully remembered, carefully taught. The memorial grew too. Families of victims from neighboring counties began petitioning to add names to the stones. Investigations continued. Slowly, some newly uncovered documents, long hidden in personal trunks and attic boxes, began connecting other mills to the Chamberlain model. They weren't as large, not as brutal, but the framework was unmistakable. 1881, under pressure from community leaders and national organizations, the Chamberlain archives were established. A 3-room building in Gallatin became the official home of the ledgers, journals, court records, and testimony. So the fire doesn't happen again. Its doors read. Ada, now in her late 20s, returned to help curate the collection. She worked tirelessly indexing survivor stories, interviewing descendants, and organizing public talks. She spoke plainly, even when it hurt. At one event, a reporter asked, "Why keep opening the wound?" Ada didn't flinch. "Because the infection isn't gone," she said. "It just changed uniforms." One day, while sorting through unmarked boxes in the archive's basement, Ada found a bundle wrapped in faded cotton. Inside, Caleb's handwriting. A journal no one had seen before, unlike his earlier notes. This one wasn't filled with dates or articles. It was personal, a letter to the future. If you're reading this, it means you're still asking questions. Good. That means they didn't scare you silent. By now, I suspect Chamberlain is a warning taught in schools. Maybe a ghost story in towns that don't know your name. But remember, what he built didn't die with him. It moved. It adapted. It smiled at you in a mirror. So here's your task. Pay attention to who profits from forgetting. And when they ask why you won't let it go, show them this page. Tell them you're not writing history or keeping receipts. Ada closed the journal, hands shaking. She placed it in a glass case in the center of the exhibit. At the bottom of the page, she added her own words. This story is not about the past. It's about the moment you stopped pretending the present was innocent. That winter, a young girl stood in the center of the Chamberlain archives, eyes wide, pressing her nose to the glass case, holding Caleb's final words. Her mother pointed to a photo nearby. Rebecca Sutton Langford standing before a federal tribunal. She was your great-great-grandmother. The woman said softly. She told the world what happened. The girl looked up, and what happened next? Her mother smiled, brushing hair behind her ear. Back outside, beneath the smoke trees, a new plaque had been installed that season. Its surface was brushed steel, polished, etched with care. It bore no dates, no names, only a question. When power knocks at your door, wearing kindness and contracts, will you open it, or will you remember this place? Visitors read it, walked quietly, and some wrote answers in chalk beneath the stone. Years later, long after Ada passed and her speeches became required reading, a teacher asked her class, "What do you know about the Chamberlain cotton mill?" A boy raised his hand. "It burned down." Another said, "It was a secret prison." A girl added, "It was the place where someone finally said no." The teacher nodded. Then asked, "What do we do with a story like that?" From the back of the room, a soft voice replied, "We don't bury it." By the spring of 1891, the Chamberlain Archives had outgrown its 3 rooms. What began as a modest repository of ledgers and testimonies had become something far larger, living record of resistance. The old mill's shadow had stretched farther than Gallatin ever imagined. Now researchers came from as far as Boston, Charleston, even London. They weren't just studying the Chamberlain mill, they were uncovering its cousins, copycats, quiet extensions of cruelty built on the same foundation, exploitation dressed as innovation, all justified with careful paperwork. It turned out Chamberlain hadn't invented the system, he'd just refined it. And across the South, across the globe, versions of it still echoed wherever the vulnerable were commodified and their suffering counted as efficiency. Inside the newly built Langford Hall, named after Rebecca Sutton Langford, the archives were now 3 floors high, climate-controlled, and staffed by interns with sharp eyes and sharper pens. On the 3rd floor, beneath a sunlit atrium, sat a small room labeled the Ledger Room. Inside, encased in pressure-sealed glass, were the original books, Chamberlain's notes, the second ledger, and Caleb Craraven's journals. Visitors weren't allowed to touch them, but they could stand close enough to see the in the paper, the places where pens had dug deep, where hands had shaken. Each visitor received a single message before entering. These are not relics, these are receipts. Ada Langford's legacy had taken on a life of its own. Though she passed in 1890, her words continued to guide new generations. Her niece, Miriam Langford, only 12 when Ada died, was already being called the next voice of Gallatin. Where Ada had fought in courtrooms and lecture halls, Miriam spoke from stages and newspapers. In one of her first public essays, she wrote, "Justice isn't just punishment, it's remembering who suffered and refusing to let them become statistics." She had never met Caleb, but she carried his journal in her bag like a compass. In late June, a traveling scholar from New York approached the archives with a peculiar donation, a locked metal box, scorched along one side, found behind a false wall in a burned-out mill outside Baton Rouge. The mill had been long abandoned, and during recent renovations, a construction worker had stumbled upon the hidden cache. The scholar, having read about the Chamberlain case, suspected a link. Archivists opened the box with great care. Inside, more ledgers not from Chamberlain, but from a man named Thaddeus Ross, dated between 1862 and 1866. His writing was neater than Chamberlain's, his language more coded, but the structure was identical. Subject lists, experiment summaries, movement logs. One entry stood out. Contact re-established with JC. Reports the Gallatin model is progressing. I forwarded the anesthetic formula. Begin replication in mobile by fall. This ledger predated Chamberlain's peak. For the first time, the evidence showed that Chamberlain had not started the idea, he had inherited it. Gallatin, it seemed, had been the middle chapter, not the beginning. The news sent shockwaves through the historical community. Debates broke out in academic journals. Was Chamberlain a mastermind or just a manager of someone else's horror? Some sought to lessen his guilt, framing him as a product of his time, but Gallatin residents, long schooled in nuance, saw through the distraction. They issued a public statement, posted outside the memorial, and read aloud by Miriam Langford. Whether he was the first or the 50th doesn't matter. He knew what he was doing. He had choices. He made them, and we made sure the world saw the cost. With Rourke's ledgers came another haunting discovery. Tucked between the pages was a folded mapper hand-drawn route of transportation lines, linking mills, warehouses, and unmarked facilities across 5 southern states. Each marked with initials. Some had been destroyed in the war, others were still standing repurposed as schools, libraries, orphanages. A wave of inspections followed. Some buildings were cleared, but others, in one former mill in Vicksburg, human remains were found beneath the foundation, just bones, scrap cloth, and a rusted surgical hook. In a facility in Columbia, South Carolina, survivors came forward, now elderly. They told stories of tests done in basements, of records burned when the war ended. The ripple effects were undeniable. The Chamberlain archives didn't just preserve the past anymore, it was actively rewriting it. But with expansion came opposition. Some local leaders began questioning the archive's influence. Why keep digging? One councilman asked during a heated meeting, "We need to move forward, not keep picking at wounds." Miriam Langford stood up, barely 5 feet tall but commanding the room. "We don't dig because we like the pain," she said. "We dig because the bodies are still down there, and every one we find means one less lie sitting comfortably above them." The chamber voted to increase archive funding the next day. Meanwhile, schoolchildren in Gallatin were now taught the full story as part of their local history curriculum, not the sanitized version, the real one. Their textbooks contained photographs of ledgers, quotes from survivors, and a timeline showing not only what happened but how it was allowed to happen. One section included a question: what would silence have cost you? Beneath it, students were asked to write a letter not of apology, but of awareness. The letters were archived, hundreds of them. That year, the smoke trees bloomed late, but when they did, they were deeper in color than ever before, brilliant, purple-red that seemed to soak the air around them. Visitors placed fresh notes beneath the roots. One simply read, "Still listening," and in the quiet basement of Langford Hall, beneath filtered light and acid-free paper, a new room was under construction. Its sign had already been chosen. It would read, "Unmarked no more." Inside, digital screens would trace known burial sites across the country, some confirmed, others suspected, all treated as sacred. Each name recovered would be etched onto a wall. Each child, each worker, each stolen voice would be given back their presence. One evening, Miriam Langford walked the grounds alone. She paused beside her great-grandmother's grave, then Caleb's, then Mary, Eleanor Winslow's, and she whispered the same thing at each stone: "We haven't stopped." By 1895, the name Chamberlain no longer belonged to a single man, that it had become a symbol, not just of horror but of complicity, of unchecked authority, of what happens when a society lets bureaucracy become blindfold. And now, Washington was listening. New generation of reformers had risen from the ashes of industrial excess. They weren't politicians in powdered wigs, they were teachers, nurses, young lawyers, newspaper editors. Many of them had studied the Chamberlain case in school. Some had family ties to the victims, others had simply felt the pull of a story, too human to ignore. One of them was Congresswoman Elizabeth Hart, elected from Illinois at just 32, and already gaining a reputation for her pointed floor speeches. In the spring of 1895, she introduced a resolution called the Federal Memory Protection Act. It was bold, controversial, and necessary. The bill would create a national commission tasked with identifying, preserving, and publicly acknowledging sites of institutional abuse and experimentation, beginning with the Chamberlain-linked mills. Some in Congress scoffed, others panicked. It would mean reopening cases long buried. Admitting federal oversight had failed not once, but repeatedly. It would drag ghosts into sunlight, but the public wanted it, especially the students. Across the country, schools had begun adopting memory forums, student-led research groups, that compiled local histories of exploitation, displacement, and silenced injustice. The model had started in Gallatin, inspired by Ada Langford's final lectures. Within a decade, it had reached nearly every state, and the Chamberlain Mill was always lesson one, that it taught them how cruelty could become policy, and how policy, when left unquestioned, became cruelty again. So when Congress stalled Hart's bill, students responded. They wrote letters, thousands, handwritten, typed, scribbled in chalk, and photographed. They arrived by postbags, bundled and bulging, addressed to senators and mayors and presidents. Each one asked a version of the same question: why are we still burying truth? Inside the Chamberlain archives, the letter count was tallied by week. By the end of summer, they had received over 53,000. Miriam Langford, personally delivered a bound volume of selected letters to the Library of Congress. Each letter was a spark. Together, they were a fire. And then, unexpectedly, something shifted. An aging senator from Virginia, Thomas D. Wakefield, a former critic of the resolution, stood before Congress and recited a story. He told of a young black boy, an orphan who worked in a textile mill after the war. The boy had vanished. His mother, a Laramie woman, searched every county for years. Only decades later had she learned his fate. He was taken, Wakefield said, not by poverty, not by disease, but by men with ledgers and polished boots, men paid by progress. The chamber fell silent. Then he said, "I vote yes." Within 2 months, the Federal Memory Protection Act passed. Its first directive, officially designate the Chamberlain Cotton Mill Memorial Grounds in Gallatin as a national site of historical reckoning. Not a park, not a monument, a reckoning. Langford Hall received new funding. Restoration of old mill ruins was begun. Every known Chamberlain-affiliated site, Vicksburg, Columbia, Mobile, was added to a digital network of public archives. New signs were erected. They didn't just tell stories, they asked questions. Who was missing from your history class? Who wrote the records you trust? What truth is still locked in a ledger? At the dedication ceremony, Miriam Langford stood beneath the smoke trees and read aloud the names of 73 victims originally buried beneath wooden stakes. She did it slowly, without notes. She had memorized every one. Children clutched flowers. Descendants held hands. Journalists from London, Cairo, and Sao Paulo sent dispatches. No longer just a Southern wound. The Chamberlain story had become a human one. And yet, beneath all the progressenda, the speeches and funding and national acknowledgement, there was a quiet question that Miriam could never shake. Would it be enough? She'd seen how easily history tried to clean itself, already. Some newspapers softened their language, referring to the events as tragic missteps, or early scientific overreach. Some universities resisted including the full story in curricula. A few states passed bills limiting the language used in textbooks. It was happening again. The silence was growing. New disguises. So Miriam fought back the only way she knew, with story. She launched a traveling exhibition, The Ledgers That Wouldn't Burn, featuring audio interviews, animated recreations, and interactive testimonies. It toured libraries, high schools, and state houses. One feature allowed visitors to search their surnames in the Chamberlain archives. Many were shocked by what they found. One teenage boy in Kentucky discovered that his great-great-grandfather had been one of Chamberlain's foremen. Another girl in New Jersey learned her ancestor had testified in Rebecca Sutton's tribunal. History, turned out, was never far away. In the final room of the exhibit, visitors were asked to answer one question: what story are you responsible for telling? Responses were pinned to the walls. Some were just names, others full paragraphs. One read, "I thought I was just a visitor. Turns out, I was a witness too." The echoes had reached Washington. And they weren't fading. They were courtrooms, into curriculum, across dinner tables. No longer a tale of a town or a time. The Chamberlain Cotton Mill had become a litmus test for how a nation remembers, and how it forgets. That winter, snow fell softly over Gallatin. Miriam visited the graves one last time before the new year. She paused before Mary Eleanor Winslow's stone, gently brushing frost from its edges. In her pocket, she carried a child's drawing sent by a school in Kansas. It showed 3 figures: a girl, a man with a notebook, and a woman standing between them with a lantern. Above them were words in crayon. "They kept looking, so I will too." She tucked it beneath the flowers and whispered, "We hear you still." In the spring of 1902, nearly 40 years after the fire that consumed the Chamberlain Cotton Mill, workers repairing the Gallatin courthouse struck something beneath its northern wing. At first, it was assumed to be rock-old foundation, maybe debris from the original build, but then came the smell, then the wood, fragments, then the bones. The work stopped instantly. A call went to Langford Hall. Within hours, Miriam Langford, now in her 40s and director of the Chamberlain Archives, stood beside the site with gloves on her hands and a knot in her throat. They uncovered 4 bodies, all buried shallow, crudely wrapped in burlap, the soil disturbed as if someone had worked fast. And in fear, the workers stepped back. The town stood still, because everyone already knew what this was. Miriam didn't panic. She ordered a perimeter set, called in federal archaeological consultants, and requested presence from the Department of Historical Justice in D.C., an agency that hadn't even existed 20 years ago, born from the very reforms the Chamberlain story had inspired. By week's end, the burial site had yielded 10 corpses, including a small skeleton, a rusted doctor's mask, and a rotted leather ledger bag. Inside the bag, miraculously intact, a partial journal, its cover burned, its pages brittle but legible, that the handwriting was unmistakable. Jeremiah Chamberlain. The journal wasn't a record like the others. It wasn't meant for business partners or collaborators. It was written in jagged script, unfinished, and addressed to the ones who will know. I thought I could bury them beneath the future, that if I laid enough stone they'd stay quiet. But their silence echoes louder than my voice now. I built something mighty. I saw the world with its mask off, and when I tried to use it, I was swallowed by it. They will burn me, but not in fire. In memory, I hear them still. It was signed only with the initials J.C. The discovery exploded across the country. Newspapers ran headlines, Chamberlain's ghost unearthed bodies beneath the law. The courthouse was built on silence. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. For decades, Gallatin's legal heart had stood above the very bones of Chamberlain's final crimes. Justice had been practiced in a building unknowingly erected atop the remains of injustice. Some called for the courthouse to be demolished. Miriam disagreed. She proposed something else. A glass floor beneath the north wing, a new exhibit would preserve the excavation, site-sealed, protected, lit from beneath so visitors could see the original burial chamber through transparent flooring, not hidden, not erased, not replaced or integrated. Above it, suspended from the ceiling, would hang the burned pages of Chamberlain's final journal, each one duplicated, enlarged, and positioned like ash frozen mid-fall. The space would be called the Reckoning Room. As it opened the following spring, visitors walked carefully over the glass, stepping lightly, others pausing to weep. Children stared downward, then upward, then asked questions. Adults didn't always have answers. One man, a professor from Maryland, stood for over an hour, notebook in hand, saying only one thing. They knew. He knew. And now we all do. Miriam stood outside the courthouse that day and thought about the irony of time. How the truth refuses to stay buried. How evil tries to escape through fire, only to be caught in ink. She thought of Caleb's attic window, of Ada's lectures, of Rebecca's ragged voice, of Mary Eleanor's shoes. And she thought of how every generation must choose whether to walk forward with their eyes open or closed. A few weeks later, a letter arrived from a small school in Arkansas. It was addressed simply to the people who kept digging. Inside was a class project illustrated booklets retelling the Chamberlain story in the students' own words. One page, drawn in crayon, showed a woman standing above a courthouse, holding a magnifying glass over the ground. The caption read, "She saw the truth, even when it hid under her feet." Miriam placed it beside Caleb's original journals, but for all the public learning, there were private moments too. In her home, Miriam kept a wooden box beneath her bed. It contained 3 items, a single child's shoe, Caleb's last editorial, the original note from Ada, "Don't let the next chapter be written without a witness." She opened it sometimes late at night, not for nostalgia, but for orientation. She needed to remember what she was rooted in. One rainy evening, she gave a talk at Langford Hall. The crowd was small, mostly students, a few journalists, and one elderly man with sun-spotted hands and a silent stare. She didn't bring notes, she just spoke. People think truth shouts, but it whispers. It hums beneath floors. It waits in lost boxes, and it keeps breathing as long as someone listens. The Chamberlain mill didn't die in fire. It died when a child asked, "Why does that wagon only come back empty?" And it stayed dead because others kept asking. She paused, her voice softening. "So if you remember anything from tonight, let it be this. Ask anyway." After the lecture, the old man approached her. "I was 10 when the courthouse opened," he said quietly. "My father helped lay the foundation stones." He looked down, as if seeing them again beneath his feet. "I always wondered why he drank so much after that." Miriam didn't speak. She just took his hand and nodded at the smoke trees outside. Langford Hall bloomed again, that spring, blushing purple and silver, as if they'd been watered not just by rain, but by memory. And beneath their branches, another plaque was placed. It didn't bear a name. It bore a question. What lies beneath what you've built? And below that, etched smaller, keep looking. In the year 1905, the town of Gallatin was unrecognizable to those who remembered the mill's roar. The air no longer smelled of cotton, dust, or chemicals. Instead, on spring mornings, the scent of lavender and cedar drifted in from the memorial gardens. The buildings bore bronze plaques noting their history. Langford Hall, once a humble archive, now stood tall with columns of pale stone and banners that read, "To remember is to resist." And beneath it all, The ledgers remained, untouched, unredacted, UNFORGOTTEN. The world beyond Gallatin had changed. 2. Inspired by the Chamberlain case, a global movement emerged, one dedicated to identifying and unearthing forgotten injustice hidden beneath the foundations of progress. Similar to the Langford model, nations began creating public memory commissions, routing through old hospitals, factories, plantations, and laboratories. What they found shocked them, and yet, it validated what Gallatin had always insisted: cruelty doesn't disappear, it hides, until someone walks in with a light. On a bright June afternoon, Miriam Langford sat on the porch of her family home, a modest white house tucked behind a cluster of smoke trees. At nearly 50, she carried more memory than most towns ever hold. Her eyes were weathered but sharp, her voice a soft command. She'd spent her life protecting a truth many had once begged to forget, and now it was protected by others. Younger voices had taken up the mantle. The archive had its own podcast, its own digital database, and a team of international researchers who flew in monthly. Miriam was ready to step aside. That afternoon, a boy of 12, Nolan, arrived at her porch with a school assignment. His shirt had ink smudges on it. His eyes were quick. He asked her a single question. How did you know where to look? She smiled, looked past him and said, because someone before me refused to close the book, and because silence makes a certain sound when it gets too loud. She invited Nolan inside and showed him an old wooden box. Inside, a photo of Rebecca Sutton, younger than she's remembered, her eyes hard as flint, a folded map marked with Chamberlain's rail routes, a key once used to unlock the mill's chemical storeroom, and a small, clean child's shoe. Nolan held it in both hands. It's small, he said. Yes, Miriam whispered, and it started something enormous. That summer, Gallatin launched the International Ledger Conference, inviting archivists, survivors, activists, and scholars from around the world. The theme, buried but not gone. The opening speaker was not a politician or historian but a teenage girl from Ghana, who shared her village's fight to reclaim ancestral land stolen for scientific farming in the 1800s. She ended with these words: you can bulldoze a house, but you can't bulldoze what happened in it. If your land smells like blood, don't plant over it. Listen. Later that year, in a quiet ceremony, Caleb Craraven was awarded a posthumous Presidential Medal of Honor. His niece, a schoolteacher named Charlotte, accepted it with tears in her eyes and a small photograph of the attic window where he'd first begun taking notes. The president's speech was brief. He didn't carry a weapon, he carried a pencil, and with it he dismantled a machine. At Langford Hall, one final addition was made. The last room in the exhibit had remained unfinished for years, a single doorway, bricked over during renovations, but now, it was ready. When the bricks were removed, the room revealed itself. A circular chamber, painted pale gray, with only a single spotlight overhead. In the center stood an empty desk. On it, a pen, a blank ledger, and a plaque that read, "This ledger is yours now." Visitors were invited to sit, to write, to record anything they believed was being ignored, erased, or deliberately hidden. Every year, the archive would review entries and add confirmed ones to a living ledger, digital, searchable record of injustice that refused to be forgotten. That fall, Miriam took her last walk through the memorial grounds. She passed the graves, she passed the trees. She paused at the glass floor beneath the courthouse, where the bones still lay, illuminated in quiet amber light. 2 children stood nearby, pointing to the surgical mask on display. One asked, "Why didn't people stop him?" The other replied, "Because they thought it wasn't their job." Miriam smiled. They were learning. Before returning home, she visited Mary Eleanor Winslow's grave one last time. She knelt, ran her fingers over the carved name. From her pocket she pulled a seed, a smoke tree seed. She planted it beside the stone. "New roots," she whispered. "Same promise." Years later, when Miriam passed, the town did not weep. They celebrated. They walked the grounds, read her essays aloud, dressed in the purple of smoke tree blooms. Children wrote messages on ribbons and tied them to the trees. "I'll tell the next one. My eyes are open. I found something they tried to hide." And in the final room of Langford Hall, a child sat at the desk. He stared at the blank page. Then slowly, carefully, he wrote, "There's something happening at my school. I don't think the adults see it, but I do." He closed the ledger, stood, and walked into history. The ledger never closed. The questions never stopped. And that's what saved them.